Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Ihr Christen auserkoren, which translates to Ye Chosen Christians. This is the last movement of the Christmas oratorio. It has instrumental interludes, so there are points in which we move from one key to the next where the modulation occurred in between the vocal part of the movement, so the modulations are going to be analyzed as direct. However, in the grand scheme of the score, much like the other chorales that have instrumental interludes, it's quite possible that they were set up in actually common chord or other types of modulations as well. I think there's only one modulation in this entire chorale that is that actually occurs in the middle of the phrase or in the middle of the sung phrase. But we're just going to hop right into the analysis. This chorale is fairly straightforward. Two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major and we end on D major. This is not the final cadence of the chorale. The chorale goes on, or this is the final cadence that involves the voices, but the instruments continue to play beyond this point. So take that with a grain of salt here. So we start off on D major. I reckon we're in the key of D major because of this. And then we move to a G major chord, G, B, D, and B. That's our 4 chord, G major. And we have some passing tones in the inner voices here, leaving us with C sharp, E, G, and B, which is C sharp minor 7 flat 5 over G. That's a 7-4-3 chord. Bach often subdivides 4 and 7. And then we go to D major, F sharp, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. 4-3 chords are kind of up in the air in terms of where they resolve. They can go to a root position triad or they can go to a first inversion triad. At least that's what I've found, depending on the context or what chord they're resolving to. And then we get B, G, B, and G, which is another G major triad, 2 roots, 2/3, kind of interestingly spelled. Still a 4 chord, first inversion though. Passing leading tone here, connecting like the 4-6. Usually the leading tone makes an appearance when we have 4-6 chords like this. And then we have A, D, and F sharp, which is a passing 1-6-4 chord, D major over A. Then we have G, B, D, and E. It's E minor 7 over G. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. This G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have A, E, C sharp, and E. It's a 5 chord, A major. This A is an anticipation. It's also a chord tone. And then our imperfect authentic cadence concludes with D major. Now cadences take with a grain of salt when they're instrumental interludes, and this goes for any other episodes you watch that have instrumental interludes. If you listen to all of the movement that's going on, it's quite possible there's an instrument that's playing above the uppermost voice and making this a perfect authentic cadence. But with the grand scheme of things, this actually isn't even it's like a quasi-cadence, I suppose. We're not getting a traditional chorale cadence where we're seeing all the voices come to a brief pause here at the fermata. This is a constant move. I added the fermata so that we have some type of roadmap to orient ourselves in the lengths of the phrases. But yes, take the imperfect authentic cadence with a grain of salt. It very possibly could just be an authentic cadence of some sort. Maybe it is actually an imperfect authentic cadence, but just analyzing the voices, that's what we have. But moving ahead, there is like 5 measures of instrumental interlude, and we at some point move to the key of B minor. Start things off with F sharp major, F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp. That's our 5 chord. And then we go to B minor, B, F sharp, B, and D. That's our tonic triad. This F sharp right here actually kind of puts the chord in second inversion, just for a little bit. I think that's cool that the chord stays entirely intact even when we get rid of the root in the bass. Then we get G, D, B, and D. It's another G chord. This time it's 6. And then this D and this F sharp here. This F sharp is a passing 7th, or sorry, it looks like a passing 7th, but it's not. We skip into it. It's a non-chord tone. We kind of get like a 1-6 chord here though if we take a look at it. D, F sharp, B, and D. And I think that it's kind of important that we mark that because we go from 1 to 1-6-4-6 and then we get another subdivided 1 chord. Maybe there's some intention there. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, I don't know, but the notes are there to analyze the chord. We then have E, G, B, and C sharp. That's C sharp minor 7 flat 5 over E. Again, Bach 11 is 2, 6, 5 chords. This C sharp's a chord tone. This E is a chord tone. This D is a non-chord tone. This E is a chord tone, so mostly chord tones going on here. The chord kind of gets turned into root position here, but we get rid of the fifth of the chord as the E skips down as well. So it's not entirely intact, so I'm not going to mark it the same way that I marked these two chords. Then we get F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp. That's our 5 chord, F sharp major. This G sharp is a chord tone, and then we have a perfect authentic cadence. And remember, take these cadences with a grain of salt. This very possibly could be an imperfect authentic cadence as well. But we do cadence on B minor, B, D, F sharp, and B. Looking ahead, we have a plagal cadence in the key of D major, and some point in between the repeat and the beginning of the, or I guess the beginning of the B section as far as the voices are concerned, we do move to the key of D major, and we start things off kind of interestingly in the key, or with like a secondary dominant-ish thing going on here. This A is an accented non-chord tone, kind of alluding to what's being tonicized here. We have G sharp, E, B, and D, which is E7 over G sharp. That's 5, 6, 5 of 5. And then we go to A major. It's very possible that the phrase beforehand started in A major and then we're in D major here, but I'm just going to analyze the whole phrase in D major because with instrumental interludes and without the entirety of the score here, we just don't know. But after our 5, 6 of 5, we do go to 5, A, E, A, and C sharp. Passing 7th in the bass, and then we get F sharp, D, A, and A. That's our tonic triad, D major in first inversion. This G is a non-chord tone, this B is a non-chord tone. This F sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get G, D, G, and B. That's G major in root position, that's our 4 chord, passing 7th in the bass. And then we get E, E, G, and C sharp. That's C sharp diminished over E, which is 7, 6. And then interestingly, we get A introduced here, which is a non-chord tone, but the C sharp and the E are both chord tones. So on this offbeat, we have like a 5 chord. So when we see 7 and 5, especially over a subdivision, it's really just a big dominant gesture. 7 wants to resolve to the tonic, 5 wants to resolve to the tonic. It's just adding to the suspense. But we don't get a traditional resolution. Well, I guess it is traditional, but we get a deceptive resolution. B, F sharp, D, and D, which is a 6 chord. So deceptive progression there. Neighbor tone in the bass before we get B, F sharp, D, and D again, another 6 chord, kind of interesting. And then on the offbeat, we have G, B, B, and D, which is a very brief 4 chord before we go to 1, D, F sharp, A, and D. Tonic triad, D major. Kind of interesting. 6 going to 4, then going to 1. That's not a progression or a cadential configuration that I'm used to, so it's kind of interesting. Looking ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of B minor. Interesting that our half cadence does not have the 5th of the chord and the melody and the voices, but then again, there's an instrument that's probably doing that. But this is the one phrase that I do believe modulates while the voices are actually singing, unlike the rest of the phrases which move somewhere while the instruments are going and then the voices are just along for the ride. But we stay in the key of D major for the majority of the phrase. We have F sharp, D, A, and A. It's another tonic triad, but just in first inversion, so we'll just change the figure bass. Then we have D, D, F sharp, and A. So the chord kind of gets turned back into root position on the offbeat. Then we get G, D, G, and B. That's our 4 chord, G major. Then we have D, D, F sharp, and A. That's another tonic triad in root position. And this B is sort of alluding to where we're going to next, but I don't really think it's significant enough to say that there's a chord progression going on. But we go from B to E here, E, B, F sharp, and G, but I think this F sharp is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and what's being implied here is 2, E minor. And then we get, interestingly enough, another E minor chord, E, B, E, and G. It's basically the exact same chord, but I do think the second repeat of this chord is where we go to the key of B minor. You could also analyze this entire phrase in B minor if you wanted to, but this is just where it sounds like the modulation occurs to me, because we really don't have any reason to think that we're moving to the key of B minor until A sharp gets introduced. So this A sharp anticipation, this F sharp here, and your score might look a little different than mine because I formatted mine to fit in one long linear chorale, but yours might be spaced a little differently. So we have 2 consecutive A sharps here, which look a little strange on the page, but I've seen other versions that include this entire phrase in the span of one measure, or at least the cadence happens at the end of the measure. But this E minor, I think, is our common chord to the key of B minor, and we cadence on 5. F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and F sharp major. Okay, looking ahead, we have our second to last vocal phrase. We have some type of modulation to the key of A major here, and we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of A major. Again, very possible that this is a perfect authentic cadence, or pseudo cadence, I guess, because we don't really get a proper pause like we would expect in a chorale that just had voices. But we start things off with G sharp, E, B, and D, which is 5, 6, 5, E7 over G sharp, and then we move ahead. This E kind of puts the chord in root position, but again, we get rid of one of the chord tones, so I'm not going to mark it on the page unless the chord's entirely intact. We then have A, E, A, and C sharp. That's our tonic triad, A major. This E is a chord tone, and we have 3 known chord tones here. Actually, this E is a chord tone as well. Let me go ahead and erase that. G sharp, B, E, and E is a 5-6 chord, E major over G sharp. And then we get F sharp, A, F sharp, and D. It's a 4-6 chord, so a bit of a deceptive progression here. And then we get the same thing going on in the lower voices, where the melody stays on equal quarter notes, and then the lower voices are staggered by like an 8th note. But this C sharp is a non-chord tone, this A is a chord tone, this E is a non-chord tone. That leaves us with C sharp, A, E, and C sharp. That's like a 1-6 chord, A major over C sharp. And then we get D, A, F sharp, and B. Another 2-6-5 chord, B minor 7 over D. Bach loves those. And then we get B, B, D, and B. It's kind of interesting. It's like taking the chord and putting it in root position and then getting rid of the 5th. But again, I don't really think that's really contributing too much to the chord progression because it gives us a not entirely intact chord afterwards. But it is a little puzzling because Bach is moving 3 voices, so I do feel tempted to call it that, but I'm going to leave it off the page. It doesn't necessarily, like I said, contribute too much to the overall progression. It's still a 2 chord of some sort. Then we get E major, E, G sharp, E, and B. That's our 5 chord. And then we cadence on A major, A, E, and C sharp, and some type of authentic cadence, imperfect or otherwise. And then we're looking to our final vocal cadence, which is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. So there's some point, it looks like this would be a point where we move to the key of D major, but I remember the transition between these 2 phrases in the actual movement, and Bach moves through a variety of different keys before getting here. So we're going to call this some type of modulation where in between these 2 phrases we get to D, and then we get D, D, F sharp, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad in root position. And then we get E, D, B, and G. One could make the argument this is a 2-7 chord, but I do think this D is a 7-6 suspension over the bass. And if that's the case as well, this B is an accented non-chord tone. This is actually C sharp diminished, C sharp, E, E, and G, which is 7-6, and that makes a lot more sense based on the way that I've analyzed these progressions in the past, because if you notice 1 going to 7-6 and you've seen some of my previous videos, chances are you know what's going to be on the other side of this progression, and that's another D major chord, but in first inversion, F sharp, A, D, and F sharp. That's a pretty consistent progression in all of Bach's chorales. We see this all the time, and other variations of it as well, in reverse and with other chords. Passing tone in the bass, and then we get A, D, and E. This D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but we know that we're expecting 5 here. And then the G is a neighbor tone, this B is a non-chord tone, A, C sharp, and A. It's another 5 chord without the 5th, so we don't need to reanalyze really. And then we cadence on D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, tonic triad, root position. And that is today's analysis. Fairly straightforward chorale, again with instrumental interludes, and I want to go back and look at some of the instrumental interlude as well as other chorales that have an instrument part that play along with them, not an entire orchestra, but whether it's, horns or clarinet, something like that. Going back and looking at those chorales and seeing whether or not the instruments actually play a role in the cadences as far as changing their structure is concerned, or filling out the chords, because I'm going back in my mind and thinking like I struggled with some of those chorales, and they might not be entirely accurate from a formal standpoint, like where the modulations actually happen and how that impacts the analysis. So maybe something to look forward to in the future. I'm fairly confident that the chords themselves, though, are accurate in those chorales, so nothing to worry about there if you've gone and watched some of those videos. Just I think it could be a little bit more thorough with my analysis. But that being said, not too much more to say about this chorale. Fairly straightforward, mostly conventional. I'd say this progression right here, 6 going to 4 going to 1, is probably the most interesting progression in the entirety of the chorale, but everything's fairly straightforward, not too much to write home about here. But if you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload. And you can also like the video if you've liked the video. It helps my videos get seen by more people, and that means the community is going to grow, and that means more discussion and more analysis, which is really exciting. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.